I live here with my husband and son. I'll pay the rent, so get out, old woman. Courtney, who had longed for country living, and Patrick, who had grown fond of the countryside, are trying to drive us out of our home. Before leaving the US for an overseas assignment, the eldest son, Matt, had asked us to check on the two of them. Was this what he meant? So, I should just do as you say? Understood. Really? You'll leave? I'll handle the contract on my own. Yes. Got my ideal country life. Hearing that my husband and I were leaving, Courtney and Patrick were delighted. However, they would learn a shocking truth a month later. My husband, Dan, and I run a small industrial machinery factory in the countryside. Though we call it the countryside, our home and factory are just a short drive from the city, so we've never felt inconvenienced by our lifestyle or work. However, now at 68, we no longer drive and find it a bit inconvenient to take the bus to the city. But, given our age, we plan to retire soon. We'll have more free time, and the inconvenience of getting to the city will only be a minor issue for a little while longer. We have a son, Matt, but he has no interest in taking over the business. We don't want to force the company on him either, and since Matt is doing well working for a trading company, we're fine with that. Matt went to Spain for work 4 years ago and hasn't returned since. He was worried not only about us, over 60, but also about his wife, Courtney, and my grandson, Patrick. I'm going to Spain for about 4 years, but I want you to keep an eye on Courtney and Patrick while I'm away. Those two are sensible enough, aren't they? Generally, yes, but they tend to get carried away a bit too much. Like impulse buying or deciding on Patrick's future education and car purchases without much thought. Well, it's not something that would bother others too much, but I'm worried since I'll be away for 4 years. It may be an overconcern on Matt's part, but being away from family for 4 years can indeed be unsettling. Understood. Leave it to me. Focus on your work abroad without worry. I casually accepted Matt's request, only to regret it later. He wanted me to look after Courtney and Patrick, but since they live near the city center, all I could really do was check in on them regularly. Courtney, is there anything you're struggling with? Feel free to tell me anything. Well, there's one thing I'd like to ask. What is it? Patrick seems to be struggling with the stress from his university entrance exam studies. Is there anything you can do? This is exactly the time to fulfill the role Matt entrusted to me. Excited, I responded. Isn't it almost summer vacation? Why don't you come here for a bit? Studying in a quiet environment might be a good change of pace. Wouldn't it be a bother to you, with my husband not around and just us coming over? Don't worry about that. We're family, after all. Accepting my offer, Courtney and Patrick came to our house. Thank you for having us. This place really is nice with all its greenery. I've always dreamed of living surrounded by nature like this, being raised in the city. The countryside can be nice occasionally, right? Matt left because he didn't like living in the countryside. Oh, they're here. Patrick, want to go fishing? Hold on, Dan. Patrick came here to focus on his studies. It's also for relaxation. Go ahead, Patrick. Despite living apart, in the countryside and the city, we and Matt's family have managed to keep an appropriate distance from each other. Thus, I thought we would never have any troubles with Matt's family. However, their visit for about a week for Patrick's relaxation became the cause of trouble. Grandma. I got into college. That's wonderful. Congratulations. Patrick successfully got into his desired school. This would mean we've kept our promise to Matt. After that, as Patrick entered college, Courtney and Patrick started visiting our house more frequently. Sorry for visiting you again. Patrick wanted to come. Mom wanted to come too. Don't make it sound like it's all my fault. You don't have to worry at all. We're happy to have you two here. It seems they have grown fond of the countryside life. Since Matt disliked living in the countryside, it's nice to see these two enjoying it. Moreover, Building a good relationship with the eldest son's wife and seeing our grandson is a joy. That was what I initially thought, but the frequency of their visits is also important. Emily, we're here again. I'll drop my stuff off and then head into town. The frequency of visits from Courtney and Patrick gradually increased. What started as day trips soon turned into overnight stays, and eventually, they started staying for consecutive nights. As their stays became more frequent, they began asking to make a spare room their own. Emily, you're not using this room, right? Can I use it? It would make it easier to come here if I could leave some stuff. Then, I'll use this room. Before we knew it, their attitude grew bolder, and they became less reserved. Courtney started loafing around without helping with any housework, and Patrick, having made friends here, would leave the house and not return until early morning. This must be what Matt meant by them getting carried away. Indeed, I started to think they were being too presumptuous. Since this situation wasn't good for them either, I decided to speak up a bit. Courtney, don't you think you're coming over too much? Is it okay to leave your place empty like that? It's fine. I'm not working, and Patrick isn't working part-time either. It seems like he's getting his college credits, too. I tried to hint that perhaps they should reduce their visits, but it seems my message didn't get through. I considered being more direct. However, Matt had asked me to look after them, and they might be stressed from city life. Besides, once Matt returns, they'll probably go back to how they were before. Worried that being too direct might ruin our relationship, I decided to endure it. However, by making this decision, my husband and I ended up tolerating the increasingly bold attitudes of Courtney and Patrick for another 4 years. What's for dinner today? I'm hoping for something hearty since it's usually light. I'll eat out, so don't worry about me. There were times when their attitude was hard to bear, but after 4 years, the end of our patience was finally in sight. Matt will be back soon. Yeah. I wish he'd worked there for another 2 or 3 years. Aren't you happy? You've barely seen him these past 4 years. Happy? No way. He's always nagging about how we should spend money for the future or how we should speak to maintain a good impression on others. In these 4 years, Courtney and Patrick seem to have become overly confident and entitled, perhaps forgetting that I am the mother of her husband and father, Matt. In front of my husband and me, they freely bad-mouthed Matt. Perhaps thinking that once Matt returns, they won't be able to complain like this anymore. Their words just kept coming. All we need is the money. That's it. We should just live in this house. That's a great idea. Courtney and Patrick seemed to agree, but my husband and I couldn't understand their reasoning at all. What do you mean by living in this house? Well, this house will be vacant in a few years anyway, right? So, why not start living here now? I'm about to graduate from university, and I could look for a job here. It's perfect timing. What about Matt? He has a job, and there's a house over there, right? Just like we've been coming to this house, my husband can visit on weekends. It's a chance to refresh from work in the countryside, and I can live away without being nagged except when my husband is here, while still receiving living expenses. Sometimes, being alone might feel more comfortable for him too, right? Isn't that a win-win? Do an elderly couple like Grandma and Grandpa even need such a big house? A 2 or 3 room apartment would be enough, wouldn't it? Plus, you're retiring, right? There's no need to cling to this house close to the factory. What do they think will happen to us in a few years? Is Matt just a cash cow to them? Why should we have to give up our house? Having endured enough, my husband and I reached our limit at the same time. Dan was the first to snap. Enough is enough. We've reached our limit. Get out, now. Exactly. No matter what, we can't just overlook what you just said. If you want to live in the countryside, look for another rental house. You never said anything before, what's wrong all of a sudden? Patrick and I like it here. Isn't it better to live in a familiar place? It might be a bit early, but could you give us this house? We'll live here with my husband and son. Do you think Matt would ever allow that? That's something for our family to discuss, not something you should interfere with, right? I've heard from Dad, this house is a rental, right? Rent must be cheap in the countryside. If I get a job and decide to, I could live here on my earnings without relying on Dad's money. That's true. If my husband says no, then Patrick will stand on his own after graduating and live here. Then, I can come to visit anytime. Do you really think that's possible? For Patrick to pay the rent? Hearing my words, Patrick seemed to misunderstand that he was being underestimated and taunted me. You're as naggy as Dad. I'll pay the rent, so old lady, get out. Their demands were selfish and absurd. Just as I was about to explain the difficulty of their ideas, Dan put his hand on my shoulder. Having been married for about 50 years, I understood what Dan wanted to say by his expression. Perhaps he thought Courtney and Patrick needed to learn a hard lesson and reflect on their behavior. Making them reflect could still be considered looking after them. So, you want us to do as you say? Understood. Really? You'll leave? I'll handle the contract on my own. Just to be sure, write down that you're leaving the procedures to us. Yes. Got our ideal country life. Hearing that my husband and I were leaving, Courtney and Patrick were delighted. After leaving the house, my husband and I temporarily moved to a short-stay apartment in a nearby city. Everything's going as planned with the company. How about your side? Everything went through on my end too. They agreed to help. I was so embarrassed, I thought my face was on fire. Then, let's take our time and wait. After moving out, we quickly prepared to teach Courtney and Patrick a lesson. A month after we left, Courtney called us in a panic. Excuse me. What is this all about? What do you mean? Don't play dumb. I got a call from the landlord of this rental house saying the rent couldn't be withdrawn from Patrick's bank account yesterday. And? What do you mean by the rent being $5,000 a month? There's no way a rental in the countryside costs as much as a luxury apartment in the city. You must have done something terrible to set us up. I haven't tried to set you up at all. We simply transferred the contract we had to Patrick. Then why is it $5,000 a month? Because it includes the rent for the factory as well. What? The rental house and the factory had the same owner, and their rents were bundled together. Obviously, $5,000 a month is beyond what a first-year employee like Patrick could afford. Even though Matt has an income from working at a trading company, he wouldn't pay $5,000 a month for a country house while having another home near the city. Therefore, we thought they would have to leave soon because they couldn't pay the rent. For such a large contract, we should need to renegotiate. Besides, how can the rent for the house and factory be bundled together just because they're close? At this point, my husband, Dan, intervened. That's because the owner and I have been childhood friends, and we started renting this place over 40 years ago on a verbal agreement, so there's no formal contract. It used to be common in the countryside to make agreements based on trust, including for warehouses or garages, land, etc. Though, such a large agreement is rare. It's understandable that Courtney, who grew up in the city, wouldn't be aware of these rural practices. However, verbal agreements are still somewhat common in the countryside, although they can lead to ambiguities and disputes later on. We've had our own disputes with the owner regarding renovations for the house and repairs for the factory. Because my husband and the owner were childhood friends, they managed to compromise, but it was just luck. Hearing this, Patrick chimed in over the phone. There's no contract, and I didn't know about the factory rent, so this agreement should be void. If you say the agreement is void, then you have no right to live there, right? Can you leave immediately, then? If you're going to play it like that, I won't pay the rent. If I don't, you can't continue renting the factory, right? Are you okay with that? You won't be able to work, and it'll trouble your employees, right? The transfer of the company's rights was completed recently. So, it's the new manager, not me, who has to worry about keeping the factory. And, troubles are part of running a business. Even if you say you won't pay the rent, if the manager can't overcome this, he can't manage the future. Besides, you and the new manager are strangers. If it comes to a dispute, don't expect any leniency. Do you really think you, a first-year employee, can win against a company? Some might find my husband's words harsh. However, this was a bluff. The discussions with the company's new manager and the owner were already settled by us. The agreement was to wait for the rent payment from both the house and factory until Courtney and Patrick left. This arrangement was possible due to the strong community ties in the countryside. I was the one who had to ask for this favor, exposing our family's shame, which was quite embarrassing. This absurd agreement is void. I'll consult a lawyer and have the contract properly redrawn. Go ahead, sue if you want. But remember, causing such a fuss in the countryside will spread rumors fast, making it hard to live here. You won't be able to enjoy a peaceful rural life then. And really, is it worth all that effort just to cling to a rural rental? We won't be on your side. I'll testify that there's no contract because we've been paying rent for over 40 years, and I'll give the owner the document where Patrick wrote that you'd handle the procedures. If the contract is invalidated, they must leave the house. If they fail to pay the rent, they might have to fight a legal battle with the company. Pursuing a lawsuit would make a peaceful countryside life impossible. Yet, they cannot afford the monthly rent of $5,000. Regardless of what they chose, Courtney and Patrick faced no bright future. They had no choice but to leave. When Patrick said he would pay the rent, I couldn't help but laugh to myself. I thought, he says he'll pay, but can he really afford $5,000 a month? Haha. After our explanation, realizing they had no option but to leave, Courtney and Patrick moved out. I apologize for the inconvenience we've caused this time. After Courtney and Patrick moved out, my husband and I went to apologize to the owner and the new president of the company for the trouble caused by this incident. We renegotiated the contract with the owner so that we would only be responsible for the house's rent. Starting next month, our rent payment will be only $300. Although I initially thought we didn't need a written contract anymore, given the current times, we decided to formally document our new agreement in a contract. With the reduced rent and the money we obtained from transferring the company's ownership, we shouldn't have any worries about our retirement life. We have regained our peaceful life, and everything has come full circle. However, the ordeal for Courtney and Patrick continues. Do you realize how terrible your actions were? Yes. I'm sorry. Yes. I'm sorry. Upon Matt's return, he naturally scolded Courtney and Patrick severely. To maintain our relationship with them and to keep our promise to Matt, we had endured their behavior, even as they started to overstep their bounds. We hadn't discussed our difficulties with Matt because we didn't want to bother him. However, once they began treating Matt as nothing more than an ATM and we were forced out of our home, we felt compelled to tell Matt everything. If it was that serious, you should have told me sooner. I'm sorry. I couldn't keep our promise. It's not something you should apologize for. They are the ones at fault, and I'm also to blame for not noticing anything even though I was in contact with Courtney. Do you want me to tell them to leave the house, or do you and Dad have a plan? You've got it right. We intended to make them reflect a bit, so could you pretend you don't know anything for a while? We won't do anything harmful. Understood. Then, I'll just handle the finishing touches. After hearing our plan, Matt decided to take matters into his own hands and discipline Courtney and Patrick. Honestly, Matt's punishment, shaped by the harsh realities of city life, was likely more frightening than anything we could have implemented. I've come to realize I've spoiled you too much. You don't understand the value of money and a home. From now on, I want you to learn about the importance of money and a home. What are you going to do? First, Patrick will have to move out after he graduates from university. I won't provide any support. What? You said it was okay to stay if I found a job nearby. and I'm about to graduate, I don't have the money to rent a place. That's the consequence of not taking part-time jobs seriously. Start saving now, even if it's late. Be prepared to be kicked out without discussion if you don't have enough money. Patrick faced the harsh reality of being forced to leave home. Without any money, finding a place to rent would be a significant challenge. This would hopefully teach him the difficulties of securing housing. Next, Courtney, you will live in the countryside. However, not in your hometown but in a completely unknown area. Live there alone and make a living by yourself. What? Alone in a place I don't know? I want you to experience the hardship of earning money without relying on anyone else. This way, you won't depend on my money and wander aimlessly anymore. Courtney, who had relied on Matt's income, was tasked with living independently in the countryside. The countryside might seem appealing for occasional visits, but it has its own set of stresses, just like the city. I believe Courtney, accustomed to relying on Matt, will struggle with the stresses of rural life and employment. Although Matt didn't mention it at the time, he was considering divorce if Courtney refused his proposal or failed to change after living alone. Thus, Courtney and Patrick, who had hoped for an easy countryside life without any struggle, faced the harsh realities of society. Later, Patrick was unable to save enough money before graduating and had to borrow from Matt to move out. They agreed that he couldn't return home for a year, a condition likely to teach him the difficulties of work and maintaining a livelihood. Courtney started living alone in a regional apartment, working part-time but had to take on a night job because one job wasn't enough to live on. Despite working tirelessly all day, her life was barely manageable and she gave up after 6 months. Matt considered divorce due to her early surrender but decided against it after seeing some understanding of work's hardship and the importance of money in her. However, Matt is still considering his options. If Courtney starts to overstep her bounds again, Matt is prepared to consider divorce. It seems Courtney has sensed Matt's intentions and has since become much more subdued. We have safely returned to our original home, and with the money we received from selling the company, we are now living a comfortable and leisurely retirement life.